One of Nintendo Switch 2's big perks is its official GameCube Classic support, available to those with a Nintendo Online Expansion sub. The selection is Switch 2 exclusive, and while the current range of GameCube titles is still in its infancy with just 4 on offer so far, they are at least all great picks. Today then, I'm testing the likes of F-Zero GX, Soul Calibur 2, The Legend of Zelda, Wind Waker, plus the very latest edition, Super Mario Strikers, to answer one question: does Nintendo's GameCube emulator on Switch 2 add any input lag? The reason we're asking is because reports have surfaced online that its emulator adds a noticeable level of latency to certain titles. For most games, it's really not an issue, but in the case of F-Zero GX, where every split second matters, the contention is that this extra lag does affect play. So, just how does the game's input latency, from a button press to an on-screen response, compare to a genuine GameCube system playing the game? Is there any truth to the claims here? Let's find out. To cut to the chase, the answer is yes, there is added latency in playing these games on Switch 2. Let's focus our testing on F-Zero GX since it's the game seemingly most affected. As ever, the test method is simple. I take camera footage at 240 frames per second and measure the number of frames between me pressing the A button and the first sign of the car on screen accelerating. At 240 FPS, or 2.39.76 FPS to be precise in my camera's case, each frame of delay counts for 4.17 milliseconds of lag. With that in mind, I multiply the number of frames by that number to get the overall latency result. I will stress though that this may not be indicative of overall latency, and other parts of the game may potentially react more quickly to a controller input. Also, it's worth noting that the monitor I'm using is a Dose Spectrum ES07D03, which has a relatively low 2.35 milliseconds of latency itself, according to TFT Central, which is something I'll subtract from all results. Using this method, we have a consistent way to measure latency, and a way to, more crucially, find the relative latency between an actual GameCube and Switch 2's emulation. With that setup in place, an original GameCube console comes in with a latency result of 71.8 milliseconds based on a 50 sample average. This is using a wired GameCube controller with a GC-HD Mark II HDMI adapter as a means to get a 480p signal to our Spectrum display. By comparison, the Switch 2 result comes in at a higher 124.1 millisecond result to the very same display, in this case using a wireless Pro controller. The key point being that we're getting an extra 52.3 milliseconds of latency, or approximately 3 frames of delay on a 60Hz display over actual GameCube hardware. To retest this with a different variable, I went fully wired by attaching an original GameCube controller to the Switch 2 via an official USB adapter, which comes in at a similarly high result to the wireless Pro controller, 123.5 milliseconds based on a 50 sample average. In short then, it doesn't matter which input you use, wired or wireless, Pro or GameCube controller via an adapter, Switch 2's issues with extra lag are always present. Even running the very same test on Switch 2 in portable mode, using its built-in 1080p LCD, we're getting extra lag over an actual GameCube, with a reading of 113.1 milliseconds while using a wireless Pro controller. The claims of Switch 2's extra latency clearly have a bearing then. However, the extent to which this added 51 to 52 milliseconds of lag actually impacts playability will vary from game to game and person to person. In the case of a less timing sensitive game like Wind Waker, it's far less of an issue in my experience. Wind Waker's focus on 30 FPS adventuring with automatic jumping between platforms makes any need for frame perfect timing less of an imperative. Even in Super Mario Strikers, it's not so much a glaring issue. Then again, for a quick overtake in F-Zero GX, to thread the needle on a tight turn on the Aeropolis multiplex stage for example, that delay does begin to stick out. Likewise, for landing a guard impact with consistency in Soul Calibur 2, those extra 3 frames might take some adjusting to, especially among those sensitive to lag. Going with original GameCube hardware is clearly ideal for the purist then. Now, it'd be all too easy to calamitize this, and it is a shame, but I'd suggest that these games are still very much enjoyable in emulation form on Switch 2. That 52 milliseconds is just something to bear in mind if you're chasing a best time record in F-Zero GX, for example. It's obviously something I do hope Nintendo loop back to improve, but there's also no denying the sheer convenience of Switch 2's classic library right now as an easy way to access that back catalogue. On top of this latency point, reports have also emerged that there's an issue with controller accuracy in the emulator. This has been highlighted by Modern Vintage Gamer 2, where in playing F-Zero GX in particular, there's certainly a difference in the way analog sticks function. In short, it appears the velocity curve isn't mapped accurately by the Switch 2 emulator, leading to overly sensitive steering compared to the GameCube original. Even using my trusty original GameCube controller from 2002, attached via a USB adapter to the Switch 2, it's simply much easier to crash into the barriers by tilting the stick left or right, even at 50% tilt. This may well be a matter of getting used to the Switch 2's velocity curve, there's always that argument, but for accuracy to the original game design, this should really ideally be identical to the GameCube versions, and especially so when using actual GameCube controllers like this. Input latency and analog stick emulation need to be addressed then, but in testing all these GameCube classics on Switch 2, there's one final issue to highlight. Specifically, in every single game supported so far, there are newly added single dropped frames not seen on original hardware. These single frame drops occur every 16 to 17 seconds on Switch 2, and it happens like clockwork. You can literally set a timer to it. The count up to 16 or 17 seconds coincides with a lost frame every time, interrupting what should normally be a solid 60 FPS line in F-Zero GX or Soul Calibur 2. For most games, it'll be a minor nuisance, though in a racer like F-Zero GX, a single dropped frame counts for a lot more while hitting blistering max speeds. It's also present in Wind Waker and Mario Strikers, which does suggest an overarching issue with Nintendo's emulator. One theory is that it's a mismatch between the 60Hz refresh output preferred by Switch 2 and the original intended 59.94Hz output of GameCube software. Perhaps that's the cause, a rounding error in the emulation, and again, I'm hoping it does get addressed. On a more positive note, GameCube emulation on Switch 2 is otherwise faithful. In fact, it improves the experience in both image quality and performance overall, outside of those added single frame drops. In comparison with original hardware, the final state of Switch 2 emulation has all titles run at a native 1280x900 resolution, boosting image clarity over the original 640x528 on GameCube. Zooming in, it's clearly a welcome upgrade in clarity, where the only downside is lingering aliasing on edges and lacking texture filtering across the ground. Also, for better or worse, that 1280x900 resolution is stubbornly fixed in place. Whether playing in the standard 4:3 aspect ratio mode or the 16:9 option available in some titles, that resolution remains, and the pixel structure simply stretches horizontally to fill a widescreen TV. Likewise, it stays at 1280x900 even if you're playing on Switch 2's own screen while in portable mode. Alas, this resolution bump doesn't affect every element on screen, and so 2D sprites, menus, and the HUD do not generally scale well, and notably Mario Strikers' 2D character selection screen looks rather blurry compared to those polygonal 3D elements. The only other change of note is the depth of field effect in Zelda Wind Waker. In the GameCube original, the effect of simulating a camera focus was heavy-handed, effectively blurring background detail. On Switch 2, by comparison, the depth of field effect is seemingly removed, or at least greatly minimized to the point of being barely visible, which I think is the right call given the boost in clarity elsewhere. On the performance side, there's more good news for Switch 2 users. For context first, both F-Zero GX and Soul Calibur 2 ran beautifully at 60 frames per second on original GameCube hardware. It wasn't perfect though, and Nintendo's Cube had its own rare performance drops in F-Zero GX, for example. The game uses a double buffer VSync method, and so anytime the frame rate starts dipping on GameCube, on the rare occasion that it does, it will crash down to a 33.3 millisecond render budget for a brief spell. This is fairly easy to spot on the cylinder knot stage at certain points, and just as you cross the finish line on others. However, Switch 2's emulation clears these drops up in all the very same instances in F-Zero GX. The cylinder knot stage and crossing the finish line now run at a flat 60 FPS. The only catch, of course, is the introduction of those single frame blips on Switch 2. For Soul Calibur 2, in fact, this is the only major difference compared to GameCube hardware, where Switch 2 otherwise puts out a solid 60 FPS. Looking to the other games, Wind Waker misses a chance to boost its frame rate by simply keeping a 30 FPS cap in place. On Switch 2, this means we're running at a flat 30 with very occasional frame pacing issues, adding trills on the frame pacing line between 16, 33 and 50 milliseconds. Thankfully, these are surprisingly uncommon and don't really stick out. Also, surprisingly, this frame pacing behavior is entirely faithful to the GameCube original, which kept a 30 FPS cap in place with similar, if infrequent, bouts of odd frame pacing. It's a missed opportunity then to gun for the full 60 frames per second, but at least nothing is lost in translation by playing on Switch 2. Rounding out, Super Mario Strikers is the game most in need of a frame rate boost via Switch 2. Looking back, performance in the GameCube original was somewhat erratic, where we had 60 frames per second in gameplay and 30 FPS in cutscenes, but there were also frequent hitches and drops during the 60 FPS on-pitch action as well. At points, in fact, on GameCube, triggering special moves like summoning Bowser could drop frame rates to 45 FPS. The point being that playing via Nintendo's emulation on Switch 2 fixes some of these issues by brute force of running on more powerful hardware. The 30 FPS cap remains in place for select cutscenes like intros and outros, but fortunately, gameplay is at least now running at a more palatable 60 FPS line most of the time, albeit with some drops on using special moves. It's a win on balance, with a few performance issues still to be ironed out. Switch 2's classic GameCube support is warmly welcomed, but certain details clearly need attending to by Nintendo. For arcade-perfect accuracy in the likes of F-Zero GX, the extra input latency on Switch 2 should ideally be addressed, and likewise the sensitivity of those analog sticks. The pattern of single frame drops in all games is also an obvious blemish, but fundamentally, the 4 games released on the GameCube Classics page so far are faithfully represented. We even have the luxury of choosing between the North American NTSC and PAL European versions, should there ever be a case where 60Hz wasn't supported on a PAL release. There's plenty more additions to the GameCube library promised in the coming months, and hopefully that will be paired with tweaks to the emulation logic, adjusting the latency, controls, and performance issues we're seeing here. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.